This is the story of Donald Pee Wee Gaskins. Much of what follows comes from his own words, taken from the final truth. Some details in the book are questionable, I'll address that later, but for the most part, this is his version of events. Gaskins grew up on a tobacco farm near Leo, South Carolina. He was small, weak-looking, an easy target. Other kids bullied him. His mother's boyfriends did worse. His size earned him the name Pee Wee, a label that followed him through life. But weakness breeds survival instincts, and it didn't take long for him to learn how to fight back. As a child, he visited a traveling carnival filled with caged animals and oddities. One act stood out: a rat dropped into a snake pit. The handler explained that the snake wasn't hungry, but it struck anyway. The rat never stood a chance. While others looked on in horror, Pee Wee felt something different, something he couldn't explain. The image burned into his mind, permanent and untouchable. It was around this time that Pee Wee began to feel something growing inside him. He described it as a heavy, molten core in his gut, rolling and shifting, never letting him rest. Most of the time, he could keep it buried, but when it rose, it took over. As a teenager, he fell in with others who shared his taste for trouble. He and his friends, Marsh and Danny, called themselves the Trouble Trio. At first, their crimes were small, breaking into houses, stealing for fun. But their need for control escalated. When they harmed someone close to them, their actions were met with swift justice. Pee Wee and Marsh were stripped, dragged into a barn, and beaten severely by their families. But if the punishment was meant to set them straight, it had the opposite effect, at least for Pee Wee. His behavior only worsened. At 13, during a break-in, he was confronted by a girl he knew. She stood her ground and grabbed a weapon, forcing him to fight back. He overpowered her, leaving her injured before fleeing. She survived but knew exactly who he was. When the police found him, his punishment was a sentence at the South Carolina Industrial School for Boys, a reformatory that would become his home until he turned 18. If he thought life had been cruel before, he was about to learn a whole new definition of suffering. The reformatory wasn't a place for rehabilitation, it was a breeding ground for violence. Breaking the rules meant brutal beatings, back-breaking labor, or being locked in solitary for days. But none of that compared to what happened behind closed doors. The weaker boys were targeted, and Pee Wee, small for his age, was no exception. He tried to escape repeatedly, but each attempt led to harsher punishments. His final escape came just months before his scheduled release. This time, he disappeared into the world, landing a job at a traveling circus. He even met a girl and married her, as if he could carve out a normal life. But then, inexplicably, he returned to the reformatory to finish his sentence. When he was finally released, whatever humanity had once existed inside him had long since been destroyed. Pee Wee tried to play the role of a family man. His wife, Mary, was pregnant, and he took whatever work he could find to support them. But honest labor wasn't enough, not for someone like him. Through an old friend from the reformatory, he got involved in a scam. They took seasonal jobs on tobacco farms, waiting until the harvest was complete. Then, under the cover of night, they would steal as much as they could carry and destroy the rest to erase any evidence. It was quick, easy, and left no trace behind. One day, 2 teenage girls from the farm stumbled upon him in the middle of one of his schemes. They taunted him, telling him he'd be caught soon enough. That was all it took. Rage took over. He lashed out, leaving one of them severely injured. For that attack, he was sentenced to 6 years in the South Carolina State Penitentiary. If he thought the reformatory had been hell, this was something far worse. He was weaker than the others, smaller, easier to control. Just like before, the stronger inmates preyed on him. But here, the punishments were crueler, and the torment was constant. Yet, Pee Wee had learned something valuable: how to adapt. And soon, he would make sure that he was the one to be feared. After 6 months of relentless abuse, Pee Wee Gaskins realized there was only one way to make it stop: fear. If the other inmates were too afraid of him, they wouldn't dare touch him. He needed to prove he was more dangerous than anyone else in that prison. The most feared man behind those walls was Hazel Brazel. He was untouchable, always surrounded by a crew of loyal followers. But Gaskins wasn't intimidated. In fact, he welcomed the challenge. He spent days gaining Brazel's trust, bringing him small gifts, playing the role of an obedient underling. Eventually, he was allowed into his cell alone. That was all he needed. On the final visit, as Brazel sat at ease, Gaskins struck. The attack was quick, calculated, and final. There was no rush, no hesitation, just silence as it ended. The consequences came fast: 6 weeks in solitary, 3 more years added to his sentence. But it didn't matter. From that moment on, no one dared to touch him. Pee Wee Gaskins had transformed from prey to predator. 3 years later, he saw an opportunity and took it. Hiding inside a garbage can, he waited until the prison truck carried him past the gates and into freedom. He vanished into the world, taking a job at a traveling carnival. Among the misfits and drifters, he met someone who intrigued him, a contortionist. She was flexible in more ways than one, and they quickly became involved. But she had her own secrets. She was a fugitive, and worse, she was using him. She convinced him to help her husband escape from jail, playing him like a pawn. Then, just when he thought they were in it together, she took his car, left him stranded in a motel, and disappeared. When the cops burst through the door, he had nowhere to run. For his escape, they added another 3 years. It felt like he would never be free. But on August 6, 1961, he finally walked out of prison and returned to South Carolina. He tried to stay out of trouble, picking up odd jobs, but the old habits crept back in, breaking into houses, stealing what he could. He wasn't interested in redemption. He was driven by impulse and something darker that was beginning to take hold. And then, he saw her. Patsy, a 12-year-old girl who lived down the road from his mother's house. One day, when he knew she was home alone, he made his move. What happened next sealed his fate. He didn't just hurt her, he took her with him. But he wasn't careful. When Patsy's aunt came home, she saw the signs of struggle. She knew exactly what had happened. And she knew exactly who was responsible. The police arrived at Gaskins' house soon after. He was there, lying in bed, pretending to be asleep, calm, as if nothing had happened. But they found Patsy too. She was curled up behind a cupboard in the corner, too scared to move. Gaskins was arrested on the spot. But he wasn't the type to stay locked up for long. Before they could even interrogate him, he escaped, slipping out of a window in the police station's waiting room, vanishing into the night. It didn't last. He was caught again. This time, they made sure he wouldn't slip through their fingers. 6 years for statutory rape. 2 more for escaping. Prison had changed. He didn't have to fight for his place this time. He didn't need to prove himself. He had already built a reputation, and that reputation kept him safe. He played the game well, stayed quiet, followed the rules, became a model inmate. And it worked. After 4 years, they let him go. Once again, Pee Wee Gaskins was free. And this time, he had no intention of playing it small. Gaskins spent his nights prowling through dimly lit bars, looking for company. But not every woman was interested, and rejection sent him into a rage. That feeling, the hot, rolling mass of anger in his gut, was becoming unbearable. It wasn't just frustration anymore. It was something deeper, something that clawed at the inside of his skull until he thought he might lose control. He started fantasizing about taking revenge on those who turned him away. And then, one day, he stopped imagining. September 1969. Gaskins was driving through Myrtle Beach when he spotted her, a 19-year-old hitchhiker trying to get to Charleston. She was young, trusting, alone. He picked her up without hesitation. But somewhere along the road, something shifted. Maybe it was the way he stared too long. Maybe it was the way he gripped the steering wheel too tightly. But she sensed it. Something was wrong. She asked him to pull over and let her out. And that's when it happened. Gaskins turned off the highway onto a dirt road. The engine rumbled, then died. The silence stretched between them. And in that moment, he had an epiphany. He had spent his whole life fighting the monster inside him. But now, for the first time, he realized he didn't have to fight it anymore. He could feed it. In his own words, Pee Wee Gaskins described the moment as a revelation, a dark, twisted epiphany that changed everything. When I stopped, I turned sideways on the seat and stared at her. And that was the moment when my miracle comes shining down. Now, don't get me wrong, I didn't see no real beam of light like Paul said he saw. But I did find my answer, surely as he found his. And the answer was simple. What I had to do was kill her. I remember smiling to myself and wondering why I hadn't ever thought of that before. If she was dead, she couldn't ever tell the law or nobody nothing. So once I had made up my mind and decided that she was going to die, somehow I could do anything I wanted with her. Anything. And so he did. He attacked the girl, making sure she couldn't escape. Then, once he was done, he took her deep into the swamps, where no one would ever find her. The water swallowed her whole, and with her, the unbearable weight that had been building inside him. That feeling, the tight, burning pressure in his gut, was finally gone. He drove to a truck stop, sat down at a booth, and ordered the biggest steak on the menu. All that bothersomeness inside me had sank into the marsh with the girl. And from then on, whenever the pain came back, I knowed what to do to get rid of it. The first kill was only the beginning. With each murder, he became more calculated. He started scouting remote areas, stocking up on supplies, and searching for the perfect victims, people no one would come looking for. Every 6 weeks, the feeling returned. The pressure, the heat, the need. He started hunting hitchhikers, lone drifters, young runaways. But it wasn't just about getting rid of them. He wanted to make each one different, to experiment, to see how far he could go. Some, I cut. Some, I sawed. I burned one. I ran a cable in and out of another, then hung her up by it. I pumped one full of water, thought that one would last longer, but she died too quick. So I didn't do that again. By October of 1970, he had already committed 10 of what he called his coastal murders, random killings, victims who meant nothing to him. But after that, he moved on to what he called his serious murders. These were different. These were people who knew him. People who, if they ever talked, could tie him to the crimes. His first serious victims were his niece, Janice, and her friend, Patricia. That night, they had been out drinking, and as they were only 15, they needed to sober up before going home. Gaskins offered them a solution. "Come back to my place," he told them. "Take a cold shower. Sleep it off." They agreed. But once he had them alone, his intentions became clear. When they tried to fight back, he made sure they couldn't. Patricia was the first to go. Janice, his own niece, was next. He buried one body on a stretch of farmland. The other, he disposed of in a place no one would ever think to look. And just like that, he moved on. Because for Pee Wee Gaskins, there was always going to be another. Naturally, due to his history, Donald Gaskins was suspected in the disappearance of his niece Janice and her friend Patricia. But with no bodies and no evidence, he got away with the crimes for years. His next serious victim, he claimed, was 13-year-old Peggy Coutinho, the daughter of South Carolina State Representative James Coutinho. Her body was found in the woods, beaten and suffocated. Another serial killer, William Pierce, was arrested and convicted for her murder. But years later, in his autobiography, Gaskins revealed details about the crime scene that, according to him, had never been released to the public. The newspapers had reported that Peggy's body was covered in cigarette burns. But Gaskins claimed that wasn't true. He had tortured her, he said, by slowly trickling acid over her skin. When this confession surfaced, Pace's lawyers filed an appeal to overturn his conviction. But the courts rejected it, arguing that Gaskins was only trying to make a name for himself. Truth or fiction? No one could say for sure. Gaskins' serious murders continued. Many of them weren't elaborate. They were quick kills done for convenience or to cover his tracks. Like Martha Dix, a woman who hung around the garage where he worked. She made jokes that she was pregnant with his baby. His co-workers laughed. The teasing angered him. So he drove her to his place and forced her to swallow a jar full of pills he had stolen from his coastal murders victims. She overdosed quickly. He dumped her body in a ditch. Or Eddie and Bertie Brown, a couple he used to fence illegal firearms. When the police started sniffing around Eddie, Gaskins feared they'd give up his name. So he invited them over for a friendly visit, then shot them both dead. He buried their bodies next to his niece Janice. But while many of his so-called serious murders were done out of convenience, Gaskins never stopped his coastal kills, murders committed purely for his own gratification. By 1973, his need to kill had become insatiable, occurring at least once a month, sometimes more. In his autobiography, he described this growing compulsion, claiming, "I noticed that my urges came as regularly as a woman's monthly cycle, always warning me a few days in advance. By the 10th, I'd start feeling restless. By the 12th, I'd be irritable and aggressive, and by the 14th or 15th, the pain would begin." Years later, I read about premenstrual syndrome, and I figured what I had was something similar, pre-murder signals. The only way he found relief was through his coastal kills, a cycle of violence he saw as both necessary and inevitable. In 1973, Gaskins committed one of his most gruesome murders, a 14-year-old runaway. He lured her to an abandoned house, where he took his time tormenting and killing her. Not long after this killing, Gaskins purchased a hearse, which he drove around town with a sign in the back that read, "We haul anything, living or dead." When people asked why he owned a hearse, he would smirk and say, "Because I kill so many people, I need a house to take them to my private cemetery." Most laughed it off as a sick joke, but given his reputation, some couldn't help but wonder if there was a disturbing truth behind his words. One of the most horrific murders linked to that hearse was that of 23-year-old Doreen Dempsey and her 2-year-old daughter, Michelle. Doreen, a family friend of Gaskins, was heavily pregnant when she turned to him for help, seeking a place to stay. Gaskins offered her a spare trailer, claiming she could stay rent-free under certain conditions. However, his intentions were far more sinister. Once inside his hearse, he restrained her and subjected her to horrific abuse. When she resisted, he struck her with a hammer, knocking her unconscious. Neither Doreen nor her daughter ever made it out alive. Their bodies were later buried in an abandoned wasteland. In March of 1974, Gaskins was searching for victims when he stopped to pick up 2 hitchhikers. Initially mistaking them for women, he realized upon stopping that they were young men with long hair. Despite this, he decided to give them a ride. Using his usual tactics, he diverted onto a secluded road, where he threatened them with a weapon. What followed was a prolonged session of torture. In a particularly gruesome act, he inflicted severe injuries before ultimately disposing of their bodies in a swamp. Up until that point, his coastal killings had primarily targeted women, but after this, he began including men among his victims. By 1975, Gaskins referred to this period as his killingest year, continuing his pattern of violence while evading capture. For most of his crimes, Gaskins worked alone, but on October 10, 1975, he committed a double murder with the help of his friend Walter Neely. The victims, half-brothers Dennis Bellamy and Johnny Knight, worked as mechanics in the same garage as Gaskins and Neely. Suspecting them of theft, Gaskins lured them into the swamp and executed them with gunshots to the back of the head. Neely then assisted in burying the bodies. To test Neely's loyalty further, Gaskins revealed additional burial sites in the swamp. Neely initially showed little concern, even keeping Johnny Knight's shoes as a souvenir. However, his conscience soon caught up with him. Haunted by nightmares and the fear of ghosts, he turned to his church and confessed everything to a priest. Encouraged to come forward, he led police to the burial site, resulting in Gaskins' arrest. Gaskins was sentenced to the electric chair, but even in prison, he wasn't finished. Using his connections, he was approached with a contract to kill a fellow inmate, Rudolf Tyner, a convicted murderer. The son of Tyner's victims feared he might receive a reduced sentence and wanted him eliminated. Although Rudolf Tyner was in solitary confinement in a maximum security wing, Gaskins accepted the challenge to kill him. First, he befriended Tyner and began supplying him with drugs. When an initial attempt to poison him failed, Gaskins devised a more elaborate plan. Using his connections, he smuggled C4 explosives into prison, hidden in the heel of a hollowed-out boot. He then constructed a makeshift communication device, essentially a plastic cup with a speaker inside, beneath which he concealed the explosives. He convinced Tyner to run wires from the device through a pipe connecting their cells, telling him it would allow them to communicate for future drug deals. That night, at the agreed-upon time, Tyner held the cup to his ear and called out to Gaskins. The moment he did, Gaskins detonated the device, instantly killing him. For all his evil, Gaskins proved himself disturbingly resourceful. As his execution neared, he began working on an autobiography titled Final Truth, in which he claimed to have killed over 100 people. However, there's debate over how much of his story was true. Some believe he exaggerated to build a legacy before his death. Since he never revealed the locations of most of his victims, much of his confession remains unverified. That said, whenever Gaskins needed to negotiate with authorities, he provided details on certain burial sites, and in every case, bodies were found exactly where he said they would be. His confessions were disturbingly specific, too. He repeatedly described inserting small lead balls into women's urethras, a method he claimed caused excruciating pain. Details like these suggest his stories were more than just fiction. Then again, maybe he was simply a skilled storyteller with a knack for the grotesque. It's certainly more comforting to believe that. In a final act of defiance, Gaskins slashed his wrists with a razor blade just hours before his execution. But his attempt was in vain. He was simply patched up, bandaged, and led to the electric chair. On September 6, 1991, Donald Pee Wee Gaskins was executed. The locations of most of his victims died with him, leaving many unanswered questions. What do you think? Was Gaskins telling the truth about his murders, or was he just spinning a gruesome tale to cement his legacy? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more deep dives into the darkest minds in history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications.